So good morning, everyone. My name is Mavra, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about racism, which is not something that a lot of people like to talk about. And you can't really blame them. As we heard from Daniel's talk, these days talk about race and racism is usually dominated by political extremes and irrational appeals to fear and emotion. So having a productive discussion about racial disparities can be difficult at best. But it is a very important topic, and I'm going to discuss how racial disparities are originating in the classroom today. So first of all, to be fair, over the years, we've made a lot of progress in society and in the education system. So the days of Jim Crow laws and anti-integration protests are far behind us, and we're working towards progress, diversity, and equality. But as always, the conversation is far from over, and at the center of this particular conversation is the issue of the racial achievement gap in education between white and non-white students. So between 1973 and 2012, the racial achievement gap hasn't come close to being bridged at all. So over the past 40 years, as society has moved forward towards equality, the racial achievement gap has sort of stagnated. And so I was wondering why that would be, and I turned to educational psychology to find some answers. So essentially, all of the social progress in the world can't really alleviate the psychological threat that some minority students can face while in the classroom. So in educational psychology, we have a term called stereotype threat, and stereotype threat is defined as the state of psychological discomfort that minority students can feel as members of a negatively stereotyped group. And this is caused by the fear of conforming to those negative stereotypes. So essentially, stereotype threat works to maintain the achievement gap in education because it can cause students to feel threatened by the negative stereotypes that they are somehow less capable, less competent, or less intelligent than other students. And it kind of works through a couple of different ways. And it stops them from building the necessary skills and abilities. So first of all, it can cause disidentification from academics, from study, or from some particular fields of study. So what this essentially means is that they feel like they don't belong or that they're not good enough to be in particular fields. And so this causes them to be disillusioned from that, and then it leads to lower confidence levels, and it leads to a negative influence on ability and building skills and competencies that are necessary to succeed. And as well, stereotype threat can interfere during the actual process of learning. So it can interfere with encoding information, evaluating information, and summarizing information, and many other things like that, which can also lead to this negative influence on ability and building skills and competencies. And finally, there is an inherent stereotype threat in testing situations, especially standardized and diagnostic tests, because when being evaluated, there is a fear of performing poorly and conforming to the negative stereotypes that you are not good enough, you are not as good as other people in terms of all of these things. So all of these things can have a negative influence on ability, and then it leads to the negative influence on performance on tests and evaluations that creates and maintains this achievement gap in education. And so a really key thing in this issue is testing, especially standardized and diagnostic testing. A very seminal study on stereotype threat showed that for racial minority students, their performance was actually demonstrably worse on tests, the same sort of test, when they thought that they were being evaluated for their competence or for their intelligence versus when they thought it was just an exercise. And as you can see, that effect was not there for white students. And so what this shows is that even when racial minority students are able to build the skills and the competencies that they need to succeed, because they can do well on the test when they think it's just an exercise, the inherent threat that's present of the fear of conforming to all of these stereotypes, that they are not good enough, has a damaging effect on their overall performance, and this damaging effect is what essentially creates the achievement gap that we saw earlier in the presentation. And what's really troubling about this, especially when it comes to standardized tests, is that in academics, on all levels of academia, from the elementary level to the secondary level to the post-secondary level, you will always run into many different types of standardized testing. So you start with your EQAO over here. In the States, we have the SATs. And then when you get to the post-secondary level, you've got your GREs and your GMATs and your LSATs and your MCATs, and the list goes on and on. And the problem is that, as we're seeing, these tests don't necessarily put everyone on a level playing field. And yet, these tests are really, really, really important gateways to success in different educational paths and different career paths, ultimately. So what this does, essentially, is it can start to perpetuate the social and economic inequalities that really form the foundation of racial disparities and racism in North American society. So this is a bit of a troubling thing with the standardized testing. And so there are a lot of issues, but educational psychology can also provide us with some answers on how to mitigate these issues and to start helping bridge the achievement gap. So one such study showed that small assignments that focused on self-affirmation and personal adequacy really helped to bridge this gap. So it increased African American student performance by 0.41 grade points. So it really helped to drastically improve it. And these are not large, overhauls of the education system. These are small psychological interventions that can really help to mitigate the stereotype threat by focusing on creating a positive self-image, which can lead to better performance overall. And with students, especially low-achieving students, there exists this thing called a recursive loop of poor performance. So essentially, with early-on poor performance or low achievement, it can lead to a sort of self-perpetuation of poor achievement, because it can lead to the fear of negative stereotypes, which causes a lot of psychological stress through the stereotype threat, which then leads to an increased vulnerability in failure, which then can lead to more poor performance, and it sort of goes on in a cycle. And the research shows that these sort of self-affirmation exercises can work to break this recursive loop and can ultimately work to start bridging this achievement gap before it becomes unbridgeable. And so what the key takeaway here is that we don't want to look at the education system and the achievement gap in the education system as just a feature of a system that we've inherited from previous generations. We want to look at it as a glitch or a bug in a model that we can work on and that we can improve from the standpoint of educational psychology. Because after all, the education system is one of the most important investments that we can make in our future through our children. And if we give every child the ability to succeed and the opportunity and the potentials to succeed, then there's no telling what that they can achieve in their lives and the legacies that they can leave behind.